Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here for another installment of What History Teaches: The Rise of Nazism. This series of webinars is held in partnership with the Holocaust Resource Center of Buffalo, Holocaust Museum LA, the Montreal Holocaust Museum, the Seattle Holocaust Center for Humanity, the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center, the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, Echoes and Reflections, Holocaust Education Resource Council, and the Ninth Candle. Thank you to all of our partners for their continuing support of this program. My name is Haley Wells, and I am the program manager at the Alabama Holocaust Education Center. Before we begin, I would like to go over a little bit of housekeeping. All attendees will be kept on mute for the duration of the program. Today's discussion will be followed by a Q&A, and you can ask your questions in the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom right of your screen. Today's presentation comes at a crucial moment in our history when the lessons of the past are desperately needed to combat contemporary iterations of hate, division, and extremism. Our discussion about collaboration and the Holocaust in the East will be presented by Dr. Kerrie Taber. Dr. Taber grew up in northern Ohio. After graduating from the University of Toledo with a degree in electrical engineering, she moved down to Austin, Texas. And after obtaining her MBA and Doctor of Management, she moved to Fort Smith to teach at the University of Arkansas, Fort Smith. Since coming to Fort Smith, Dr. Taber has become involved in the community through the nonprofit she created, the River Valley Skin Cancer Alliance, serving on the board of the Reynolds Cancer Support House, and helping with other events and organizations. Without further ado, over to you, Dr. Taber.
Okay. Well, I appreciate everybody being here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen. Um, and as Haley mentioned, go ahead and there we go. Go ahead and ask any questions. If you think of them while I'm talking, feel free to put them in the chat. Haley's going to keep an eye on that stuff. So I'm going to be talking to you about the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. And let me just tell you a little bit more. As Haley mentioned, I grew up near Cleveland, about 30 minutes to the west of Cleveland. I'm first generation American on my mother's side, and she was actually born in Lithuania and came to the U.S. when she was about 8 years old. And so it was a typical middle class sort of upbringing. I every Sunday we went to my grandfather's house. And every Christmas, New Year's, Easter, that was just part of what we did. So I spent a lot of time around my grandfather. And otherwise, I mean, my dad was a mail carrier. My mom stayed at home until I started school full time in first grade. And then she worked as a florist and some other jobs. And so I thought everything was just like a normal middle class kid upbringing. But then I found out some things about 14 years ago that kind of changed the way I view that. So my mom's family, as I mentioned, she was born in Lithuania in 1942, so kind of in the middle of World War II. And they left Lithuania as the Germans were retreating. I still remember a story that my uncle told about them crossing a field, him holding my mom's hand. She was about 2 years old, and Germans throwing grenades down in basements and things like that. But that was just about the only story I heard about them leaving Lithuania. They spent about 6 years in displaced persons camp in Germany, and then in 1950 they came across the U.S. and the U.S. S. Hershey. Um, Now I don't mention my grandmother that much because she passed away when I was 2 years old, so I have no recollection of her, other than maybe some small stories that my mom told me. So everything that I had interactions with in terms of my mom's family was with my uncle and my grandfather. Um, And very little was mentioned about Lithuania, even though, you would think that I would have grown up hearing the language, hearing about the culture. I heard none of that. The only time I heard Lithuanian was around my birthday, my brother's birthday, and around Christmas when my grandfather and my mom would actually talk in front of us about gift ideas. And I told him one time that I knew what they were talking about, but I didn't know what they were talking about. And I told him that wasn't very fair of them to do. But that was the only time I heard Lithuanian. And then they said nothing about why they decided to leave. So I always wondered growing up why they decided to leave Lithuania and come to the US. Um, and growing up, I would only hear like real small stories. A lot of stories I heard were about my mom's time in displaced persons camp, about going to um some of the local stores with her grandmother because she would actually translate for her. Um, I heard, the story from my grandfather, but there were a few stories that kind of raised some red flags for me, but didn't really tell me what had happened. One was that my um mom told me that she was told that there were Nazi officers at her christening. And when I got older, I knew enough to know that Nazis usually didn't interact with the locals unless they were involved some way with them. So I thought, well, maybe he was like a city administrator or something like that. And so didn't really think much about that. Always kind of wondered, but never really asked more questions. But then about 14 years ago, I was visiting my parents down in Texas. They had moved down to Texas, and they mentioned a story that was in the Cleveland Plain Dealer that described a man who looked like my grandfather or sounded like my grandfather. Mentioned the ship they came across on, everything that they described sounded like him, but that the article was about a wanted World War II war criminal. And so I guess my dad saw it first, showed it to my mom, and they called my grandfather. He said, "You need to come out here." So they drove the 30 minutes out to Cleveland. And he said, "Listen, I was someplace when something happened, nothing major, but I'm totally innocent of anything." And they kind of went, "Okay." And that was it. So when I came home from visiting my parents, I changed some search terms because I was trying to find stuff out about my family in Lithuania. And I found this article. And in that article, it changed everything because I found out that my grandfather was a lieutenant in the Lithuanian Auxiliary Police and was directly involved in over 14,000 Jewish deaths. People ask me what it felt like to find that out, and I really have no words to describe it. I was the youngest grandchild and the only girl, so I was treated very special by my grandfather, had very special relationship with him, and at that moment I found out that he is one of the biggest monsters that there could be. So it my world basically crumbled at that point. Um, and so I try to understand how this person who at the most would say things that I would chalk up to generational. So he would say some things where it's kind of like, yeah, we don't say those things anymore, sort of thing, but nothing that really pointed to him being racist, anti-Semitic, or being somebody who would have been involved in killing that many people. So I try to read some books about people who were in like the death squads. Um, I think one was called Ordinary Citizen, and then I wish I could remember the name of the other one, but they're basically looked at the same sort of groups from a different angle as to why they did it. But a lot of these people were just normal human beings that you wouldn't think prior to World War II would have done anything they did. So I tried reading those books, trying to understand why my grandfather, this man I loved, would have done that. Flash forward about to 2023, actually 2021, I decided to write a book, and it included part of the story about my grandfather. And as I started writing the book, because the story about my grandfather wasn't enough for me to write a whole book on, I started doing research into other things, particularly around the Holocaust in Lithuania and Eastern Europe. So that's where I started to learn a little bit more about the fact that we don't really know much about the Holocaust in that area. We hear a lot about, Germany and Poland and the concentration camps, but we really don't hear anything about it beyond that. So the Holocaust we know, which is mainly from Germany, there was economic depression that happened. So after World War II, because of the reparations that they had to pay, and the fact they lost the war, and they lost a lot of working men, their economy was depressed. And then you had high anti-Semitism, and that was around the world at that time. Very high anti-Semitism. And then you had the Great Depression hit. So there was a need to find a scapegoat for that. And one way that I describe it to people, and I actually use this because I do teach at the university, you can't hate something intangible like a subject or an economy, but you can hate a person. And so they used the Jewish people as their scapegoat for the reason why we're in the situation is because of them. Even though many of them fought valiantly in World War One, even though many of them were helping the economy, they pointed to them as the reason why everybody else was suffering. And so basically what they did was they said, hey, if you get rid of them, your situation will improve. So then they developed the slave labor camps, the concentration and death camps. It eventually moved. It did start off with the firing squads, moved to the um, trucks where they pumped the exhaust into the back of the trucks, and then progressed to the showers and the crematoriums as a cleaner, faster way of taking, killing all these people. And then this was the main formula for how this happened in the Nazi areas. Also in those areas, the way that they got from Hitler getting charged to the Holocaust was a slow progression. You had propaganda, you had all these things that slowly dehumanized a whole group of people so that they didn't bat an eye when their neighbors disappeared or when any of this stuff happened. They just kind of looked the other way because, hey, that's not my problem and these aren't really humans. So that's how it happened in Germany. Now, when you start looking beyond Germany into Eastern Poland in the Baltics, so um, there was the pact between Germany and Russia that basically divided Poland and the Baltics in an agreement between Germany and Russia. Those countries were not involved in it. So Germany said, we'll take Western Poland, you take Eastern Poland, you can take the Baltics, and we won't fight each other. So when the Russians came into Eastern Poland and into many of those areas, they removed the intellectuals and elites. And what happened was because there were a large number of Jewish people who backed the Communist Party, a lot of the Jewish people tended to be put into those leadership positions. So they were seen as collaborators. And this kind of put a dark mark on the Jewish people, regardless of whether they supported the Russians or not. So also, it was estimated about 350 to 500,000 Jewish people served in the Red Army. So they were seen as being very strong in support of the Russians. So the um the Jewish people were seen as communists, were seen as Russian. So then when the Germans moved into Poland, when they broke the pact, they moved into Poland. All these Jewish people were seen as collaborators and seen as targets to get rid of, to take out all that frustration that people had over what the Russians had done. Now, in Eastern Poland, in the Baltics, in Ukraine, and all those countries that um, the Nazis went into after taking control over from the Russians, things were done a little bit differently. They had no gas chambers or crematoriums. What they did was they had trenches and firing squads, and they set up local paramilitary groups in order to do the executions. So it was a very personal setup. Um, and one of the reasons why the Germans went away from the firing squads was because of the psychological toll it took on some people, and also because bullets cost money. So they unfortunately did not have any issues finding people to help them out when they moved into these areas. And as I mentioned before, anti-Semitism was worldwide. The U.S. does not cover in our history the things that we did that make us partially complicit as to what happened in Europe in terms of turning away the St. Louis, um, turning away other ships and other people who try to come to the U.S. And also making the immigration process for Jewish people from Europe almost impossible to get through. So anti-Semitism was huge. Um, and again, the Russians eliminated the intellectuals and elites and replaced them with Jewish people. So in Europe, and we saw this after World War II, those who were seen as collaborators were not treated well. And in this case, because they had people coming in behind who encouraged that and gave an avenue of getting back at this group that they saw as collaborators. They had no issue finding people to sign up and become part of these auxiliary police to help them kill off the Jewish people. So the Lithuanian Auxiliary Police, this is the one I dug into most just because of my grandfather. But this is the template that they use for a lot of the different areas that they went into. Just about any country that they went into, you will find auxiliary police that they used. So it's a paramilitary organization, so it's set up with ranks. My grandfather was a lieutenant. He was actually second in charge of his battalion. They worked under the Nazi leadership. So they were subjected to the Nazi rule. And they were mainly used to massacre the Jewish people. And in Lithuania, it's estimated that 90 to 95% of the Jewish people were eliminated during World War II. So Lithuania did have a very large uh, Jewish population, but this action really it more than decimated that population. So in Lithuania, the violence started actually before the Nazis came in. So there was a period of time before the Nazis were established, after the Russians retreated, and before the Nazis fully came in. There were like a few soldiers there, but not a whole lot. Um, the Lithuanians started to enact violence against the Jewish people. Now, Kaunas or Kovno, it goes by a few different names depending on who you talk to. That's where my grandfather was, and that's where my mom was born. And so one of the things that Hitler didn't want to do, and he actually pointed to our South when he said this, is that he didn't want things to be done basically outside of like a process or organized. So this happened before the Nazis came in, and what they did was they gathered some Jewish people at this garage. I'm not even going to attempt to say the name. I'm horrible at Lithuanian. Um, but 40 to 60 Jewish people were killed. And the way that they were killed was that they were beaten to death with shovels, iron bars, and a lot of other brutal methods. And what they did was, if they lost consciousness, they actually had a hose that they used to spray water on them to wake them up again so that they could beat them some more. It was a very brutal event. And as you can see in some of these pictures, people showed up to watch. Much like the spectacle lynchings in our South, these people saw this as something that needed to be done. They lifted children up on their shoulders. And some of the Germans who were there who saw what happened were actually appalled at what the Lithuanians did to these Jewish people. And these are men who had been um, going through Europe and killing Jewish people without any qualms, but they were actually appalled at what happened at this garage. So basically what happened was the Germans who were there said, "Listen, you guys can't do this anymore. We're gonna organize things so that, you do it the what they call the right way." So the Nazis' method was to organize partisan groups into the auxiliary police. These were groups that tended to be ones that either fought against the Russians, or in terms of my grandfather, he was actually conscripted into the Red Army, but he left and he signed up for the auxiliary police. And they carried out what's called flying squads. So these were small squads that were sent out to neighboring areas in order to execute Jewish people. And then they actually created a process of doing these executions. So the local people would gather all the Jewish people in that village or maybe in the surrounding areas and put them into the local synagogue, and they use that as their ghetto or their concentration camp. They notify the Nazis in Kaunas or Vilna or any of the major locations and say, "Okay, we have them all rounded up." At that point, they send out one of the flying squads. Um, and then this didn't take long for the Germans to set up. Within a week of the garage massacre, they had their first major killing. And this happened at the 7th Fort on July 4th through July 6th. This is one that my grandfather was involved in. His name is mentioned several times. And so they brought the Jewish people from the ghetto in Kaunas to the fort, and they had the men sleep in the ravines, and then the women slept in like this underground area. And they were taken in groups of 10, taken to a crater that was in the middle of the fort. Um, I've read different things. One said it was a bombed out area. Another one said something else, but it was a crater that was it was a large hole in the middle of the fort, and they started shooting them. There were so many that they didn't get through them all the first night. So the men slept overnight in the ravine. The women were underground, and the next morning, um, well, on July 6th, what they did was at that ravine, they lined up men around the outside the ravine with machine guns, and they fired down into the ravine. My grandfather's name wasn't mentioned as the one leading that group, but there's nothing to say that he wasn't there. He didn't witness that. Um, and then on the last day of the killings, they would actually line up more along the trenches or in the crater, and they would use machine guns just to speed up the killing. So on July 6th, 2,500 people were killed. And in the end, after those 3 days, 5,000, 8,000 people were killed. They don't know the exact number, but it was a rather large number. This is really the last time they did anything at the Seventh Fort, and that's mainly because it was too close to the community, and people started showing up, and it wasn't something they wanted to have people showing up to witness. After the Seventh Fort, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying, one of the reasons why the Germans went away from the firing squads to execute Jewish people. 117 men asked for discharges from the Lithuanian Auxiliary Police. One company commander committed suicide, and many others deserted. In fact, during the Seventh Fort, there were men who refused to go inside the fort. They would guard the people outside the fort, but they would not go in there and participate in the killing because they just couldn't do it anymore. And so when people say, well, your grandfather did what he did because he had to, that's not true. He could have been one of those, he could have made it 118 men who asked for a discharge, but he didn't. Um, I'll never know why he did it, but and I can never understand it, but it wasn't something you had to do. As long as you weren't fighting against the Nazis, they were not going to do anything to you. They weren't going to force you to do it. So there was a toll to it, but unfortunately, there were still plenty of men who were willing to help the Nazis with their plans. So, as I mentioned, the flying squads, this was one of the units that my grandfather was over. As I mentioned, the local partisans would round up the Jewish people in the local synagogue. They would often have the Jewish men dig the trenches. There is one record where they tried to tell the Jewish men that they were digging a trench for water, um, and they pretty much knew what they were digging the trench for, and they refused to do it. So they had to gather up some local people in order to build the killing trenches. Once they had everybody there, they notified the Nazis, and so they gathered everybody together, and the flying squads would come out to the killing area and do the killings. Um, there were a couple of stories I read in terms of my grandfather being involved that really kind of hit home in terms of how normal these people saw this. So after one of the killings, they had killed about, I think it's like 270 people, men, women, and children. And afterwards, they went to a pub to get a beer with the locals. And what went through my mind was thinking that he saw this as just the end of a working day, that there's nothing more normal than going to grab a beer with your coworkers at the end of a day. And it was just kind of hard to picture anybody being able to do that. But they would just do the killings, they'd get back in their trucks and they'd head back to Kaunas and then just wait for the time to be sent out again. And this happened in many different areas throughout Lithuania, the Baltics, and many of the other areas that the Germans controlled. So the largest killing of Lithuanian people happened at the Ninth Fort. Ninth Fort was a spot where a lot of different killing events happened. But this one on October 29th was the largest single killing of Jewish people in Lithuania. My grandfather was involved in this. And if any of you guys have ever had a chance to go to the Virginia Holocaust Museum, it was actually put together by a Lithuanian Jewish man. And one of the rooms was around Ninth Fort. And when I had a chance to talk there, that was like the last room I got to before I had to do my talk. And it was kind of disconcerting to walk into that room that's dedicated to the Ninth Fort on October 29th and know that my grandfather was one of the ones who was doing the killings there. But the Jewish people were moved from the ghetto to the fort just like they did in every other method. And then what would happen is that another group of men would took over guarding them as the first group would go back and get more. So it was a whole assembly line process that the Germans had set up to make this, as efficient as Germans could make it. The smaller groups were led into the fort to one of the trenches. They had several trenches there because of how many people that they ended up killing. The victims were told to disrobe and line up along the trenches. In at the Seventh Fort, Ninth Fort, there's a lot of um things in the record from witnesses and stuff like that that they stole a lot of stuff, whatever was remaining that these people might have. Um, then they'd line them up along the trench, and they'd shoot them. And so over 9,000 Jewish people were killed on this day. 2,007 men, 2,920 women, and 4,273 children ended up being killed on that day at Ninth Fort. Um, as I mentioned, this was the largest single killing of Jewish people in Lithuania. It's also one of the last times my grandfather was noted um, in any of the records, but there is some speculation that he might have been involved in more. It's just that they have not found any records of that. So on December 1941, SS Colonel Jager reported today, I confirm that Strike Commando 3 has reached the goal of solving the Jewish problem in Lithuania. The only remaining Jews are laborers and their families. Um, the killing of so after they eliminated many of the Lithuanian Jews, what they would do is they'd bring European Jewish people to Lithuania, but in a strange moral, I guess, compass that the Germans had, they didn't want the Lithuanians killing the European Jews. So they stopped involving them in the actions that they took, but they still used like the Ninth Fort mainly for a lot of these killings, at least in the Kaunas area. So as I mentioned, they use similar setups across all the Baltic states. So in Latvia and Estonia, um, Belarus, they also had auxiliary police, Ukraine, and approximately 300,000 Jewish people were in the Baltic states prior to World War II. It's estimated that 200,000 of them were murdered um, by the Nazis and the auxiliary police. So I'm gonna go ahead and end it there. It's a little bit earlier than I thought it would be, but I'm sure you guys probably have a lot of questions or um, if you want to discuss some of the topics. The big thing is that um, the reasons behind why these people were involved was different than in Germany because of the fact that a lot of them felt that need for revenge after the Russians took over, the anti-Semitism, but there wasn't a lot of propaganda that was forced on them in order to get them involved, but they were very willing in helping out.
Awesome.
Go
Thank
ahead.
you so much for this. This was, of course, extremely, extremely interesting. And I know it is a hard topic for you to talk
Mhm.
about with it being so connected to your family. So thank you for being so willing to, share about your grandfather and about the history you studied. And I do have quite a few questions. And then, I'm sure more questions will continue to come in from the audience. We have plenty of time to go over all of them. So please do put any and all questions you have in the Q&A box down at the right. But one question I would like to start with, because you talk mostly about Lithuania, but you ended on talking about the Baltic states. I wonder if there were, and if you know the answer to this, were there differing motivations for, people forming these police groups and killing the Jews in the differing Baltic states? Was there any variance in motivation or feelings towards the Jews, or was it all sort of linked to the same issues of, the Soviet Union pulling out, Jewish elites sort of being in power? What did that situation look like in the other
I
Baltic
mean,
states?
I didn't really fully look into the other countries, but based on just the timing of everything and the way that a lot of the Europeans reacted to collaborators, I think the main reasons are basically saying there might be some maybe smaller underlying reasons
Mhm.
of past history or other things that happen in those countries. But in terms of the major things, it's, the Russians left. And I'm sure that some of the people who collaborated who were not Jewish and decided to stay and not leave, which would have been not wise to do, would have met, a pretty bad fate too.
hmm Well, so this brings up a question that I was thinking about as you were talking, because it's obvious that there was a hatred towards the Jewish people in Lithuania. But like you said, this is different from in Germany, where the Germans are really, surrounded by propaganda about the Jewish people, and they view them, as inferior in many ways. So I wonder, would you consider the sort of hatred of the Jews in Lithuania to be anti-Semitism, or is it sort of a politically motivated hatred? And obviously, at the end of the day, the result is the same. But I do think it's interesting to think about whether this sort of falls into the larger Nazi race ideology or whether the Nazis capitalized on sort of political tensions that were already there.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily the Nazi um, anti-Semitism that was built on um, the whole, they're inferior and all the propaganda, but anti-Semitism was very large throughout the world. And if you read, I think it's Robert Tushman's book. It's very long. It's interesting, but it's definitely one of those very dry, long nonfiction books.
Mhm.
But it brought up some of the things about the medieval time, about the different times that Jewish people have been subjected to violence. And
Mhm.
most of the time, it happened around Depression times.
Right.
And a lot of that is because, Christian beliefs for a long time was that if you loan money, then you're committing a sin. So the people who loan money were the Jewish people. Well, when depression gets high and people can't pay their loans, they lose their stuff, right? So then all of a sudden, well, I'm losing my stuff because of you. Well, no, you're losing it because of the economy. You can't pay them back. It's not their fault. But they have to take it on somebody, right? And so
Mhm.
all those things line up, and now all of a sudden you have high anti-Semitism around the world. You have a Great Depression. So basically, you had a perfect storm for something to feed to it. And
Mhm.
then you had the fact that the Russians came in. The Russians were very brutal. They killed many people. They had their own version of genocide that, again, we don't talk much about. They came in, took out anybody who they thought was going to be against them, and the people they put in place were Jewish people. Now you have anti-Semitism and collaborators. So I think a lot of the reasons the same as anti-Semitism, but how it got there was just a little bit a twist of a difference.
Right. And you do, of course, have, the Nazis at the beginning of the Nazi regime link communism to Jewishness. They
Yep.
present communists as the enemies and then they say all Jews are communists.
Yep.
So I'm guessing in places like Lithuania, that was something they really capitalized on because there was already that hatred of communists, from the
Yep.
Soviet Union.
Well, and one interesting thing is that in I think it's Vilna, they have the Genocide Research Center. The thing is that the genocide that they're researching is the Soviets against the Lithuanian people, not
That's
what the Lithuanian
interesting.
people like they do a little bit because the guy who was in charge actually wrote the article that I found, but they also have put up there as heroes, some of the people who became partisans against the Russians after World War
Mhm.
II, but they had also helped the Nazis in killing the Jewish people. But then they see them as heroes. So it's a
Right.
very complicated, twisted, um, kind of moral thing that happens in that, and I've
Mhm.
actually talked to some of the history professors here when we talk about anybody, which what do you use to judge them,
Mhm.
right? And so it's a very confusing sort of thing there.
Well, that goes to my next question of, of course, the Lithuanians have been oppressed by the Russians who
Hmm.
pull out, and then the Germans come in and they sort of see these, Germans as saviors. I wonder if you came across anything, at primary sources or whatnot of Lithuanians who saw what they were doing as sort of a resistance work. Did they see themselves as resistance fighters who were sort of fighting for their country? How did they view their actions?
Well, you mean in terms of against the Russians?
Well, and against the Russians and against the Jews,
Okay.
because the Jews were so linked to the
Yeah.
Russians, how did they sort of conceive of what they were doing?
Well, it's funny because they did see what they were doing as being good for the country,
Hmm.
right? They were seen as heroes. In fact, there's Sylvia, I can't think of her last name right now, but her family, she grew up in Chicago, and she was always told that her grandfather was this big hero, or
Yes,
her father was this
Sylvia
big hero.
Fodi.
Fody, yes, I knew it
Yeah.
started with the F. I was like, ugh. Um, but that, he was actually one of the people who helped the Nazis. And it it was hard for her to find that out because he was put up there as such a hero because he had fought against the
Hmm.
Soviets.
Right.
And so that's where you get into a very complicated, you know, way to view a person
Hmm.
because, what they did was horrible, but what the Soviets were doing to him when they were in the area was also horrible.
Right.
And so it's a very complex way to look at it. And, it's I do think they saw it as saving their country, which part of that, the anti-Semitism underneath is like, well, our country would be better if it wasn't for them.
Hmm.
Which is part of the problem is that, some of the people who they killed didn't like the Russians either.
Right.
But you're Jewish, so all Jews like the Russians, so we will get rid of you. So yeah, I think they did see it as saving their country. This is what we need to do in order to become a stronger country, even though if the Russians didn't end up pushing them back, they would have been still under Nazi rule. And there's always a question of what happens when you get rid of all the Jewish people, who are they going to come for next?
Right. Well, and it's very interesting because, you have the Soviets who are committing their own sort of form of genocide in the early part of the war, who then become the liberators of Eastern European camps in the second half of the
Hmm.
war and are sort of lauded as saviors. So it's very complicated, the lines of loyalty that go back and
Yes.
forth during the war.
Yep.
Is that is the narrative in Lithuania today still that these partisans are heroes? I mean, what
Yeah.
is the sort of national belief about them?
They're still seen as heroes. In fact, I think it was about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, at this genocide center, they actually had either a picture or a bust of one of the men who was very involved with the Nazis in killing Jewish people, but he's put up there as a great partisan who fought against the
Right.
Soviets. Um, so it's almost like, and this is what a lot of people do, and in the US we do the same thing. Um, put people up as heroes, but we're going to ignore the part because if we look at that part, then we have to look at everything else around that, right? We don't want to look at the part that they did helping the Nazis. We're going to ignore that part because we don't want to admit that we took part in that.
Right.
It's just like in my research, one of the things I found was that, all of a sudden all these German families were helping the Jewish people,
Hmm.
right? Well, if all of them helped the Jewish people, there wouldn't be 6 million who were killed.
Yeah.
All of a sudden everybody's like, no, 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 no. We weren't involved in that. He just fought against the Soviets. He never did any of that other stuff. It's very easy for people to just, we'll just ignore that whole thing that happened.
Hmm.
Um, you know, People look at some of the war heroes that we have, especially in terms of like the Native Americans stuff like that. Well, no, look what they did. So
Hmm.
they're basically ignoring this whole section of their history. And it's easy to do because the world is ignoring that whole section of history that they did.
Right.
Everyone looks at, oh, well, the Russians, did all these purges and stuff like that, killed all these people. Well, what happened during World War II?
Yeah.
No, no, we don't want to talk about that. So
Well, and it's a hard topic, I
it is.
think, for people to get into studying because it's far away. There's language barriers. It's very easy for that narrative about heroism to continue to be perpetuated.
Well, and we always want to talk about our bright
Um,
spots, right? We don't want to talk about the dark things in our history.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, it's very complicated. And I think that's a really interesting thread that you've pulled out is this is not a sort of black and white case of, a guard at Auschwitz, Germans
Hmm.
who hated Jews and just wanted them gone. Although obviously what they did was brutal and atrocious,
Hmm.
there are sort of interesting loyalties that we see with the Holocaust in the East and with the political situation in the
Yep.
East that is not the same as it is in Nazi Germany.
Yep.
And it was very, very, very interesting the way that the Nazis were against the sort of extra legal brutality. It seems like
Hmm.
not because it was brutal, but because it was extra legal and they wanted it contained in sort of
Yeah.
legalistic ways.
Yeah. There when I was doing my research, there was some interesting things that I found, and it kind of explained some things, but um, I in my book, I actually look at like the spectacle lynchings in the South, and I end up tying to some of the things that I found that were said by like Hitler and some other ones. So the Olympics that were going to be in Germany, countries wanted to boycott it, and
Mhm.
the the Germans said, "Well, wait a minute. Why are you threatening to boycott and you're giving us a hard time? You're not saying anything about the U.S.
Mhm.
South and their lynchings. They're actually killing people, and at that time, they were not killing any Jewish people. They're creating laws, taking away their citizenship, basically dehumanizing them, but they weren't
Right.
killing them yet.
Yeah.
They're like, well, hey, they're killing people, we're not. So why are you again? Why you have such problems with us? And then the fact they said,
Mhm.
we don't want to have things like the lynchings here. We want to have everything, kind of controlled. We're gonna have laws around it, which is why they took away citizenships. They made it so
Mhm.
that any violence against Jewish people wasn't against the law. So yeah, it was. Oop, I think we just lost Haley. Um, Let me see if I get to Q&A. I don't think I can. Oh, here she comes. Haley, are you back?
I'm back. Yes.
You're back. Okay.
Did it totally cut out?
We're all here.
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Okay. Did it keep playing when I vanished for a minute?
Yeah. So everybody's still here. It just said that AHEC became the host.
Yes. Yes, we should be back. Sorry about the difficulties every first time it has happened in our months of doing what history teaches.
You're still kind of freezing up on us.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, you can hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, wonderful. Sorry about the technical difficulties, everybody. Hopefully the recording is, you know, good, but I think because it seems like we're having some internet problems that I'm going to try to wrap this up a little.
Well, looks like we lost her again.
And I'm out and back again.
Okay.
Okay. Um, let's see. Can you hear me?
Yes. In fact, your screen much better now too.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to end us a tiny bit early just because we are clearly having technical difficulties. I want to see if I can get us through one last question because I wanted to go sort of high level at the end and ask, what we can learn from this history about how hate spreads and about how we can sort of combat it or quarantine it, as you say in your
Hmm.
book. So let's see if we can get through that question and then we'll finish out the
Okay.
session.
So, I didn't fully mention my book, so I wrote a book titled Quarantining Hate, and I wrote it after January 6th, and it's about how when society pushes back on hate, we don't see what we're seeing today. We don't see it growing and spreading. So, if you look through our history, especially like the spectacle lynching in the South, I think is like the best example of when society started pushing back on hate, that we started seeing things change because it was supported from the individual person up to the president. Woodrow Wilson thought that Birth of a Nation was lightning in a bottle. He loved the movie, which is about the most racist movie that's ever been made. Um, and so I think the biggest thing that I've seen in the research that I did, and just from knowing from because I grew up with being totally shielded from hate. My mom was not hateful because she was shielded from it because you do not tell a 2-year-old anything because it will not be kept a secret. So she didn't know about her father until I finally told her like a month before my book came out. So if anybody wants to know how not to tell your mom about her father, hit me up. I could probably tell you. Um, and so I grew up just accepting people for how they were. I didn't grow up hearing all that hate. Um, and so I'm sure my grandfather would probably, I don't know if he'd be proud of me or not with how, I believe. But I do think that the we have very vocal silent or very vocal minority, and they seem like they're so large. And what happens is that the people who feel like they're outsiders or feel like they're less than feed on that, and they now have a target for their frustration, their hate, their fears, their everything. The problem is that we have a silent majority who are not pushing back and saying, "Hey, no, this is not the way we want our society." And I think the big thing is that we need to call out our leaders when they bring up anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, transphobic, homophobic, any of that stuff, from having it out in the open because that's when it's going to spread. That's when you're going to start seeing more and more laws being put in place that disenfranchise people. You see more and more hate, more and more just the stuff happening that dehumanizes or pushes people to the outside. So I think that overall, and we go through waves of this. This isn't the first time we've seen the rise of hate.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, probably not be the last time, but you can't just sit back and just hope that it'll get better. You have to take an active role because the only time things have changed is when people have become active.
Wonderful answer. Well, thank you so much for that. Thank you for your presentation, for the really insightful answers to all the questions. Thank you, everybody, for sticking with us through all of our technical difficulties today. We've done a whole season of What History Teaches, and this is the only time it's happened. So I feel pretty good about that. The next installment of What History Teaches will take place on Monday, June 8th at 11 a.m. Central Time, and this will be in partnership with the Toronto Holocaust Museum and Dr. Marcy Shore, who will speak about the rise of authoritarian regimes in Eastern Europe and how Hitler's rise to power affected Eastern Europe. So this should build really well on everything that Dr. Taber talked about today and bring some additional context to what she talked about with Lithuania and with the Baltic states. You will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording of this program. And for all our events, we get our best traction of word of mouth. So we would greatly appreciate you sharing the recording and the schedule of programs with your friends and colleagues. This recording will be posted on our YouTube channel and also on our website, so you can find it there. And please do share it. It's such an important topic. So thank you again for joining us. We can't wait to see you at our next program and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.